Hey, it's Stephen, and I've got a story for you tonight that'll put a little chill in your holiday season. Christmas is supposed to be a time of joy, right? Family, food, gifts, maybe even a little magic in the air. But, well, some things that happen around Christmas, they don't exactly fit that picture. This story was passed on by one of our longtime members, from someone who's seen things that should have stayed buried. Trust me, it's one of those stories that sticks with you long after you hear it. So, grab a drink, settle in, and let me tell you about Sarah and a Christmas she'll never forget. It was Christmas Eve, 1982, and the snow was falling hard, blanketing everything in that quiet stillness that only winter can bring. Sarah was back at home after her first semester at college, looking forward to a peaceful Christmas with her family. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, the tree twinkling in the corner, and everything felt normal. But something wasn't quite right. Her parents were acting a little off. Her mom, usually the picture of calm, was overly excited, way more than she needed to be about the holiday decorations. Her dad, on the other hand, was distant, quiet, almost like he was trying to avoid something. Still, Sarah tried to shake off the weird vibe. After all, she was home for the first time in months. The evening went by without any issues. Dinner, small talk, the usual holiday stuff. Eventually, her parents tucked her in, kissing her goodnight. Her mom, with a smile, said, "The Christmas spirit will protect you as long as you believe," and Sarah smiled back. But that tight feeling in her chest didn't go away. She lay there in bed, trying to fall asleep, but something just didn't feel right. She couldn't put her finger on it. It was like the house was too still, like something was waiting in the shadows. And then, in the dead of night, she heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from downstairs. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but they grew louder, closer. Someone was walking around in the living room. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She was frozen, unsure of what to do. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, Sarah gathered the courage to sneak out of bed. She crept quietly to the top of the stairs, listening. There was a pause, complete silence. Then, just when she thought maybe it was all in her head, she saw it. A figure, standing in the living room. It was a man, hunched over, wearing a torn Santa suit. The kind that's been worn too many times. His face was hidden in shadow, but Sarah could make out the bloodstains on his clothes. Something about the figure just felt wrong. Her heart skipped a beat as he slowly turned and locked eyes with her. His gaze was cold, lifeless. There was something strange about his face, like it didn't belong there, like it wasn't fully human. He took a step toward her and whispered her name, soft and broken. "Sarah." She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air felt like it was thickening around her, suffocating her. And in his hand, he held a gift, wrapped up in shiny paper, red and green, just like the presents under the tree. But something about it was off, too fresh, too new. "Open it," he whispered. "It's for you." Her heart raced. Every instinct told her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the gift. It was like it was calling to her. A part of her wanted to open it, wanted to know what was inside. But then, just like that, something snapped her out of it. She turned and bolted back up the stairs, slamming her bedroom door behind her. She sat on her bed, trying to catch her breath. She tried to tell herself it was just a nightmare, that she was imagining things, but the feeling in the pit of her stomach wouldn't go away. The footsteps had stopped, but she couldn't shake the thought that something was watching her. Something in the house, waiting. The next morning, Sarah tried to act normal. Her parents were downstairs, having coffee, acting like everything was fine, like nothing had happened. She tried to put it out of her mind. Maybe it was just the stress of finals, maybe it was all just her imagination. But when she went to the attic to grab some old decorations, that's when she found it. At the bottom of a box filled with old Christmas lights and tinsel, there was a gift. The same red and green wrapping paper, the same bow. But this time, it wasn't fresh. It was old, torn. The paper was worn, the ribbon faded. But the tag was still there. For Sarah. Her heart dropped into her stomach. It couldn't be. She didn't even want to touch it. But there it was, in her hands, cold and heavy. Just sitting there, like it had been waiting for her all along. That night, she didn't sleep. She stayed in her bed, wide awake, listening for the footsteps, the whispers. But there was nothing. Just silence. Until the clock struck midnight. Then, the footsteps came again. Slow. Purposeful. They echoed through the house, getting louder as they drew closer to her room. Sarah's blood ran cold. She held her breath, praying it was just her imagination. But the footsteps kept coming. They reached the door. There was a creak, and then the door slowly opened. And there he was, the man in the torn Santa suit, standing in her doorway, holding the same gift. "You were supposed to open it," he whispered, his voice raspy and hollow. "You all were." Sarah backed away, but she couldn't escape. The figure stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "The Christmas spirit doesn't forgive," he said, his voice growing colder. Before she could react, the man lunged forward, his cold hands gripping her arms. She struggled, but his fingers were like iron. The room began to get darker, colder. The shadows stretched across the walls, like they were alive. And then, just as quickly as it started, it all stopped. The figure was gone. The house was silent. Sarah sat in her bed, breathless and shaken, her body frozen in place. She could feel something was wrong. Her parents were gone. The house was empty, as if they had never been there at all. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know what had happened, only that the house, the gift, the figure, it was all part of something she could never escape. The Christmas curse. Sarah never spoke of that night again. She left the house the next morning, and years later, she moved far away. But every year, on Christmas Eve, she would still hear the footstep, the whisper of her name, and the warning that the gift was never meant to be opened. So, there you have it, a Christmas tale with a twist. Some gifts, some traditions, they come with a price. Maybe next time you're around the tree, unwrapping gifts, you'll think twice. Some presents are meant to stay closed, and some Christmas spirits don't forgive. Story 2. It was Christmas Eve, and snowflakes danced in the night air, swirling as if they were alive. Outside, the world was quiet, blanketed in a perfect sheet of white. Inside the Bennett family home, however, there was nothing but warmth, laughter, and the comforting smell of pine and baking cookies. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. It was the perfect setting for a holiday tradition that had been passed down through generations. The air was filled with the usual hustle and bustle of Christmas preparations. The wrapping of gifts, the trimming of the tree, the occasional clink of glass as family members made a toast to the season. But as Emily Bennett sat back on the couch, watching her family prepare for the evening's festivities, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Perhaps it was the growing tension in the air, the way her mother, Clara, seemed just a little more distant than usual. Or perhaps it was the strange sense of foreboding that crept up on her every year at this time. Every Christmas Eve, her family gathered together to open the oldest gift in their collection, a box wrapped in gold paper, adorned with a simple bow. No one knew exactly what was inside. In fact, no one had opened it in years. Emily had heard the stories growing up. The box had been handed down to each generation of Bennetts, given only to the eldest child when they came of age. It was a rite of passage, one that marked their transition into adulthood. But there were warnings too, warnings that no one should open the box before midnight, or else they would suffer the consequences of disturbing its content. As she stared at the tree, her gaze fixed on the shimmering box hidden amidst the branches, Emily's fingers instinctively tightened around the hem of her sweater. The thought of opening it filled her with both excitement and dread. This year, it was her turn. She would be the one to break the seal. Her mother caught her staring at the box and smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Emily, it's almost time," Clara said softly, her voice strained. as if she had rehearsed the words 1,000 times. "Are you ready?" Emily nodded, though the truth was, she wasn't sure she was ready for whatever was about to unfold. She had spent the last few weeks in a haze, trying to ignore the deep sense of unease that had settled in her chest. But now, as the hands of the clock ticked closer to midnight, the feeling of anticipation grew. "Let's just get it over with," Emily thought to herself. Her father, Thomas, stood nearby, adjusting the tree skirt as he hummed a holiday tune. He glanced at Emily with a knowing smile. "You'll do fine, sweetheart. Just like your grandmother and great-grandmother before you." But Emily wasn't so sure. She had heard the rumors, the whispers that had circulated over the years. The stories of how each recipient of the box had experienced strange events after opening it. How the curse that came with the gift had somehow seeped into their lives, bringing misfortune, fear, and death. She didn't believe in such things, of course. She was grown now, an adult. But there was something about the way her family spoke about it, the way they all treated the box like some sacred object, that made her pause. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. "It's just a gift," she whispered to herself. "Just an old tradition." As the clock neared midnight, the family gathered around the fire, eagerly awaiting the moment. The tree lights twinkled softly in the background, and the scent of cinnamon and gingerbread hung in the air. Everyone was talking, laughing, but Emily felt a quiet emptiness in the room. The laughter seemed hollow, the words strained, as if something was being left unsaid. Finally, Clara stood, her movements deliberate, and nodded at Emily. "It's time, my dear." The room fell silent. Emily stood and approached the tree, the weight of her family's expectations pressing heavily on her shoulders. She reached for the box, feeling its cool surface beneath her fingers. It felt heavier than it looked, like there was something inside it, something far more substantial than just an object. She tore off the wrapping with a trembling hand, revealing the plain wooden box underneath. The brass hinges creaked as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled against a bed of dark velvet, was a delicate silver necklace. The chain was fine, intricate in its design, and the pendant, a twisting vine pattern with tiny red gemstones, was both beautiful and haunting. The silver glinted in the firelight, and the gemstones seemed to pulse, though Emily could have sworn they weren't glowing at all. Her breath caught in her throat. It was simple, beautiful, but the moment her fingers brushed against the pendant, she felt something else, something cold. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and a strange, almost imperceptible hum filled the air. It was as though the necklace was alive, its presence suffocating and oppressive. "Put it on," Clara said softly, her voice cracking slightly. There was something almost pleading in her tone. Something desperate. Emily hesitated, the weight of her family's gaze on her making her pulse race. She glanced around the room, but no one said a word. The box had been passed down for generations, after all. It had to be part of the tradition. With shaking hands, Emily placed the necklace around her neck and fastened the clasp. As soon as the pendant touched her skin, she felt a jolt of electricity course through her body. Her heart raced, her breath shallow. She opened her mouth to say something, to ask if anyone else had felt it, but the words caught in her throat. The air grew colder. Emily stood frozen, her fingers grasping at the pendant as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. And then she heard it, a voice. "You shouldn't have opened it." The words echoed in her mind, but when she looked around the room, no one was speaking. The family members were staring at her, their faces frozen in place, their eyes wide with something that could only be described as fear. "Mom?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What's happening?" Clara's face was pale, her lips trembling. She reached for Emily, but before she could speak, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, moving in unnatural ways. The firelight flickered, casting long, contorted shapes on the walls. The temperature continued to drop, and the room seemed to shrink around her. Emily's breath came in quick, ragged gasps, but there was no air, only the oppressive weight of whatever had been unleashed. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "It's too late." Her vision blurred. the room spinning as though she were caught in the eye of a storm. She tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't move. She felt trapped, and then, through the fog of panic, Emily saw the shadow move across the floor. It was dark, shifting, taking form, something that wasn't quite human, something that was twisted and wrong. The shadow reached out for her. Emily's heart thudded in her chest as the dark, shifting shadow crawled toward her. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something far worse, something far darker. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt the room tighten around her, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The fire in the hearth sputtered, sending embers into the air, but no warmth reached her. The air was freezing, biting into her skin. Her legs felt like they were made of stone. She couldn't move. Her body was locked in place as her eyes locked onto the figure moving across the room. It was tall, the silhouette of a man, but its movements were jerky, unnatural, like something trying to force itself into a shape it wasn't meant to take. The closer it came, the more the air seemed to hum with malevolent energy. It was suffocating, like a heavy fog descending on her. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice came again, louder this time, and Emily's pulse quickened. It was deep, guttural, filled with a sorrow that twisted into something far more sinister. The voice didn't come from anyone in the room. It came from the shadows themselves, as if the darkness were speaking directly to her. "Now you've set it loose. You've made the choice." The words felt like they were being carved into her mind, each one more excruciating than the last. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She wanted to run, to tear the necklace off and flee, but her body refused to obey. The figure was closer now. Emily could see the outline of its face, hollow, pale, and distorted. Its eyes were nothing more than empty pits, a black void that swallowed everything in its path. Its mouth opened, but there was no sound, only the unsettling sense of something inhuman reaching for her soul. "Mom," she gasped, her voice finally breaking through the paralysis. She turned to her mother, Clara, her face pleading. "Mom, what's happening? What is this?" Clara stood frozen by the fireplace, her eyes wide with terror. But she didn't move. She didn't speak. It was as if her own fear had her captive, as though she was powerless to do anything but watch as her daughter became consumed by whatever dark force was in the room. "You've awakened the curse," the shadow's voice rasped. It seemed to be speaking directly to Clara now. "You all knew what would happen. You knew, but you couldn't stop it. Not after all this time." Clara's lips trembled, and a single tear slid down her cheek. She took a step toward Emily, but the room seemed to ripple around them. The floorboards groaned, and the walls cracked as if the house itself was trying to resist the curse's power. It was no use. The air was thick, suffocating. Emily could barely breathe. The shadow moved closer still, its form growing more defined, solidifying into something human. But there was nothing human about it. It was a nightmare come to life, a twisted reflection of the past. Emily's gaze flicked to the necklace again, still cold against her skin. It felt as though the pendant was pulling at her very soul, like an anchor dragging her into the depths of darkness. The shadow reached out its hand, fingers stretched toward her. "The Bennett family has always had a price to pay," it whispered. "You open the box, and now you will pay it." Clara's voice finally broke through the suffocating silence. "Emily, no. Don't listen to it," she cried, her voice filled with desperation. "Please, don't let it take you." But it was already too late. Before Emily could react, the shadow's cold, skeletal fingers closed around her wrist, sending a jolt of icy terror through her body. The air around her seemed to freeze solid, and for a split second, time itself seemed to stop. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, and her body began to tremble violently, as though every inch of her was being torn apart. The room darkened, the shadows closing in on her. Her vision blurred, and she felt as if she were being pulled into an abyss. She gasped for air, but there was none to breathe, only the sharp taste of fear on her tongue. And then, the curse began to take hold. Hours passed in a nightmare. When Emily awoke, it was not with the gentle warmth of a Christmas morning. Instead, she was sprawled on the cold, wooden floor of the living room, the eerie silence of the house pressing in on her. She gasped, her breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts as she shot upright, glancing around. The fire in the hearth was now just smoldering embers. The lights on the tree had gone out, their soft glow replaced by the harsh flickering of the dying fire. But something was wrong. The house felt different. The warmth was gone, replaced by an unnatural chill. The walls seemed to press in on her, the air heavy with something unseen, something malignant. Her eyes darted to the spot where the shadow had been moments before, but now there was nothing. Except for one thing, the necklace. The silver pendant still hung around her neck, its cold weight a constant reminder of what had happened. The red gemstones now seemed darker, almost black, their eerie glow pulsing faintly in the dim light. Emily reached for it, her fingers trembling. She tried to tear it off, but it was as if the necklace had fused with her skin, impossible to remove. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Dad?" No answer. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the kitchen, but the house was empty. The smell of gingerbread and cinnamon was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of something rotting. The once beautiful Christmas decorations now appeared twisted, deformed, as if something had corrupted them in the dark hours since the curse had been released. "Where are you?" she cried out, fear creeping into her voice. She searched the house, calling out, but no one responded. There were no sounds, no signs of life, only the oppressive stillness of a house left in the wake of something horrifying. Her thoughts were a blur, confusion mixing with terror as she tried to piece together what had happened. Her mind kept flashing back to the shadow, the cold fingers wrapped around her wrist, the chilling voice that had echoed through her very soul. She collapsed onto the couch, her hands clutching her chest, feeling like she might suffocate. What had that thing been? What had it done to her? "It's too late." The voice returned, not from the shadow this time, but from within her own mind. A whisper, a warning. Suddenly, the walls around her seemed to shake. The floor beneath her feet groaned. Something was coming. A growing madness. Emily's body felt heavy as she stood, the weight of dread pulling her down like an anchor. She stumbled down the hallway, the house creaking and groaning with every step she took. Each door she passed seemed to open into a new nightmare. The hallways stretched unnaturally long, the walls pulsating with a rhythm that seemed to match the frantic beating of her heart. Her pulse was loud in her ears. She turned the corner and froze. At the end of the hallway stood her mother, Clara. But something was wrong. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes wide and vacant. Her lips were twisted into a ghastly smile, the kind of smile that didn't belong on a living person. Clara's hands were raised, palms facing Emily, as if she were trying to ward something off. "It's too late," Clara whispered, her voice hollow and distant. "You've released it. We all have to pay the price now." Emily's stomach turned as the darkness around her deepened. The house felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that grew stronger with every passing moment. "We can't stop it," Clara whispered again, her voice trembling. "The curse, it's too powerful." With those words, the floor beneath them cracked, and Emily's world plunged into darkness. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around Emily. The house was no longer the place she had known, a home full of laughter and warmth. It had transformed into something alien, something monstrous. The walls creaked and groaned, as if the house itself were alive, feeding off the fear that had taken root in her heart. Emily stumbled backward, her hands pressed against the walls as her breath came in short gasps. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, her warning repeated over and over, "The curse is too powerful. You can't stop it." But Emily refused to believe that. She couldn't. She had to do something. She had to find a way to break the curse, to undo what she had done when she opened that cursed box. As the darkness around her thickened, her eyes locked onto something in the distance. A faint light flickered at the far end of the hallway. It was a candle, its flame trembling in the stillness of the air. And standing before it, a figure. It was Clara. But this time, Her mother didn't look vacant or ghostly. She looked real, alive. "Mom!" Emily cried out, rushing toward her, but something stopped her. She froze mid-step, an invisible force locking her in place. Her heart pounded in her chest as the air grew heavy again, and the sound of scraping metal filled her ears. The walls began to bend, distort. Suddenly, they weren't just walls anymore. They were eyes staring at her, watching her every move. The air felt thick, suffocating, like it was pressing down on her, trapping her inside. Clara's figure stepped forward, her face pale, her expression twisted in agony. Her eyes were wide, wide with fear. "Emily, you need to listen to me." Clara's voice broke, barely a whisper. "You have to leave. You've set it free." Emily reached out to her mother, but Clara took a step back, her face contorting in pain. "You have no idea what you've done." The words came like a whisper in the wind, distant and cold. "I never wanted you to open that box. I never wanted this for you." "What do you mean? What happened to you?" Emily shouted, her voice cracking. Clara opened her mouth as if to speak, but her voice failed. Instead, a terrible scream filled the room, one that made Emily's blood run cold. It wasn't Clara's scream, it was a deep, guttural cry that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The house around Emily shuddered violently, as if it were a living thing, shaking in pain. The darkness thickened, curling around her, consuming every bit of light. Her heart raced. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Everything was closing in on her. And then, a presence. Something cold, something ancient, something evil. She could feel it. It was coming closer. The ground beneath her feet shifted. The floorboards cracked, and Emily stumbled to the ground. Her hands scraped against the cold wood, and that's when she felt it. An icy, invisible hand wrapping around her wrist, pulling her down, dragging her into the depths. "No!" Emily screamed, trying to claw her way out of the grip, but the hand was relentless. The darkness pressed down on her, suffocating her. A voice in her mind: "The curse is too powerful. You can't escape." Her thoughts grew muddled, and the weight of fear seemed to press down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. This is it. This is how it ends. But as the darkness seemed to swallow her, one thought pierced through the terror: her mother's face. Clara had warned her, begged her to leave. And now Emily understood. It was too late for her mother. But it wasn't too late for Emily. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Emily forced herself to her feet. Her legs trembled, and her vision blurred, but she reached for the necklace, the cursed pendant that had started it all. Her fingers closed around the silver chain, and she pulled, yanking it with all her might. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp, echoing snap, the necklace broke free. The moment it did, the world around her seemed to explode. The house screamed, an unholy, bone-chilling scream that rattled the very foundation. The walls shook violently, the floors cracked, and Emily's ears rang with the sound of destruction. But in the midst of the chaos, the darkness began to recede. The presence, that had haunted her for so long, finally began to fade. The air grew lighter, warmer. The walls stopped warping. The house, this cursed, twisted thing, began to return to something familiar, something human. Emily collapsed to her knees, clutching the necklace tightly in her hand. Her mother's voice echoed in the distance. "Emily!" She looked up, blinking away the tears. Clara was standing there, her figure solid, her face now free of the terror that had gripped her earlier. The anguish and fear that had marked her mother's face had melted away, leaving only the softness of love. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with relief. You're okay." Clara reached out to her, pulling her into an embrace. "You did it, Emily," she said softly. "You broke the curse." For a long moment, they stood there, holding each other, the weight of the night's horrors beginning to lift. The house was silent now, silent and still. No more shadows, no more whispers. Emily pulled back, still clutching the necklace. She stared at it for a long moment. The red gemstones that had once pulsed with darkness now seemed dull, lifeless, and cold. She dropped it onto the floor and stepped away. You don't have to be afraid anymore, Clara said, her voice full of warmth. It's over. But as Emily looked around the room, something shifted. The floorboards creaked, the shadows still clinging to the corners of the room. For a brief second, Emily thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye. Her pulse quickened and her breath hitched. A small, cold gust of wind whispered through the room. She glanced at the fireplace, where the dying embers had turned black. A shadow flickered at the edge of the hearth. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. "Mom," Emily began, but her voice faltered. Her hand shook as she looked toward the spot where the shadow had vanished. Clara stood beside her, her face pale again. "Emily," Clara's voice trailed off, her eyes wide. Something was wrong. The terror that had once plagued them was far from over. And somewhere in the depths of the house, the curse still lingered.